I watched from a distance while my grandma and grandpa fished on their lake in the backyard. But one thing confused me while Grandpa cast his line and watched his rod, waiting for the anticipating tug of a fish. Grandma's gaze remained fixed across the lake, her head tilted intently towards the dark fringe of woods. I never saw her look at the bobbing lures. She didn't even seem interested in fishing at all. I thought that maybe she just simply enjoyed looking at the trees. But a nagging feeling persisted. There was more to her gaze than a simple love for nature. It was summer break, and I decided to spend it at my grandparents' house in Knoxville, Tennessee. They lived in a 2-story house, recently built in 2018. It connected directly to a lake, with a dock jutting out on the far right side where my grandpa kept his bass boat. My grandparents were a sweet and quiet couple. They kept to themselves most of the time, living a peaceful life in their little corner of the world. Every summer, though, my visits became a tradition. Grandma's invitation was always an automatic yes, her warm smile and gentle voice a beacon calling me back. There were countless things to love about my grandma, her kindness and generosity at the top of the list. If I wanted something, it was usually an automatic yes from her too. But one of the things I truly cherished most was her stories. Unlike Grandpa, who mostly stuck to tales of his time in the military, exciting stories filled with bravery and adventure, of course, Grandma was a bottomless well of stories. Whether it was a funny story from her childhood, a heartwarming story about a kind neighbour, or a fantastical bedtime story that transported me to magical lands, Grandma always had one on hand. She was one of those special grandmas who could weave a story from thin air, her words painting vivid pictures in my mind. Grandpa, on the other hand, was a man of few words. A quiet strength emanated from him, and the stories he did tell were always about his service. He'd talk about the places he'd been, the challenges he'd faced, and the lessons he'd learned. While not as fantastical as Grandma's stories, they held a different kind of magic, a testament to his resilience and the experiences that shaped him. One of the things I always admired about Grandpa was his outdoor skills. He'd tell me most of his knowledge came from his military training, jokingly saying they prepared him for anything. He was a true outdoorsman, the kind of person I'd trust implicitly if we were ever lost in the wilderness. He knew everything about fishing, the best spots on the lake, the best techniques to catch different types of fish. Some of my favorite memories were spent on his boat, cutting through the cool morning water, the sun rising over the horizon, and the gentle hum of the motor a comforting lullaby. Every night, Grandma dipped into her seemingly endless well of stories. I never quite understood how she did it. Her mind was like a sprawling library, shelves overflowing with stories to tell. One night, she'd tell me a story of brave knights seeking vengeance, their swords gleaming in the sun. Another night, she'd tell me a story of a land shimmering with magic spells, and cursed lands. Then there were the scaly stories. Now, Grandma usually avoided them. She knew how they affected me. But the thing about those stories was the detail. Oh man, the detail. They were so vivid, so real, it felt like I was peeking through a crack into another world. A world where the monsters and creatures she described lurked. A world so terrifying that I felt like falling through that crack would kill me. Every night was the same routine. Nestled under a patchwork quilt in the guest room, I'd wait with bated breath. The soft click of the doorknob was my cue. Grandma, her face etched with a lifetime of stories, would enter, a gentle smile gracing her lips. She'd pull up a rocking chair, its rhythmic creak adding to the lullaby effect. Then, in a warm voice, she'd begin telling me a story. One night, though, tucked under the patchwork quilt, I waited for Grandma's nightly visit. The soft click of the doorknob announced her arrival. "Ready for another story?" she asked, her voice a warm rumble. I nodded eagerly. Nights at Grandma's were journeys to magical lands, each story more thrilling than the last. But tonight I craved a different kind of story, a different kind of excitement. "Can you tell me a scary story tonight, Grandma?" I blurted out. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by a thoughtful pause. Unlike her usual repertoire of action-packed adventures, her stories have always steered clear of scary ones. She sat beside me on the patchwork quilt, her usual mischievous eyes replaced by a thoughtful gaze. Her eyes flickered towards the window for a moment before returning to me. Then, with a gentle smile, she began. "Those woods outside your window," she started, her voice a warm rumble. I instinctively glanced towards the window, the familiar silhouette of the trees, outlined across the lake. "There's something in those woods," she continued, her voice dropping to a hushed whisper. A shiver danced down my spine, though the room remained pleasantly warm. Those simple words made me so uncomfortable that I was tempted to just tell Grandma to stop. But the truth was, I was hooked. Grandma did tell me scary stories on rare occasions, but they were always fictional, completely disconnected from the real world. She continued, "Every 7 years it comes out of those woods. It emerges, a creature that's been on this earth for thousands of years. It crawls on all fours. It hunts, a silent predator searching for its prey." I began to tense up a little. The room remained quiet, but the air felt heavy. "Its body is like a man, but twisted and contorted," she murmured, "and its limbs elongated, reaching out at odd angles. Its skin is black as coal, making it difficult to spot during the night." I swallowed hard, my eyes instinctively drawn back to the window. The trees, once comforting, now seemed to writhe with unseen shadows. "But the worst part," she continued, her voice barely a tremor, "is its eyes, multiple eyes, scattered across its head like a spider. They pierce the darkness, searching for an unsuspecting victim." She continued, her voice a hushed whisper, sending shivers down my spine. "Sometimes, if it has trouble finding prey, it ventures closer, closer to houses, searching for unlocked windows." My breath caught in my throat. The image of eyes peering through the glass sent a jolt of terror through me. "If it finds an opening," she murmured, "it will crawl inside and snatch the closest person to it, dragging them back to the woods." I squeezed my eyes shut, the warmth of the quilt a poor barrier against the sudden chill. "It keeps its victims alive for 7 long years," she whispered, "feeding off them slowly until the hunger returns, and it's time to hunt once more." My grip tightened on the blanket, and my knuckles were white. A cold sweat was dripping down my skin. "But don't you worry," she said, her voice gentling. "As long as we keep the windows locked, we'll be safe. And don't forget to do the same at your mom's house." She rose from the quilt, her smile strained at the edges. A smile meant to reassure, but one that couldn't hide the sliver of unease in her eyes. Her movements seemed slow and deliberate as she walked towards the window. My eyes followed her, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She stared out of the window for a moment, as if checking to make sure the thing wasn't around, and then she checked to make sure the window was locked. Just as she was about to turn away, I blurted out, unable to contain the question that had lodged itself in my throat. "Grandma, have you ever seen it?" She paused for a few moments, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face, before a reassuring smile crept onto her lips. She didn't answer me. She simply leaned down and kissed my forehead, a gesture filled with a strange intensity. "Good night, darling," she whispered. Then, with a gentle click, she shut my door behind her. I was awake for most of that night, staring at the darkened window pane. The familiar silhouette of the woods outside now held a new kind of terror. I kept wondering if I would see that face my grandma described, a face with multiple eyes staring back at me. Eventually, exhausted from fear and lack of sleep, my eyelids drifted shut, and I finally drifted off. While I slept, I dreamt of its form shifting and writhing in the darkness. I ran, my legs pumping, but it was like I was running on ice. Panic seized me as the figure lunged, its long arms wrapping around my legs. It dragged me, a ragdoll, through the grass, the stench of damp grass filling my nostrils. The woods grew bigger as the thing dragged me there, its jagged edges threatening to devour me whole. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as the branches of the trees were about to engulf me, I jolted awake, gasping for breath. Light streamed through the window, painting familiar shapes on the ceiling. The room held a peaceful stillness. It took several deep breaths to slow the pounding of my heart. Relief washed over me, chasing away the lingering dread. Since that night, despite Grandma's steady stream of new stories, the creature in the woods has remained a constant shadow in the corner of my mind. Thankfully, the nightmares, those terrifying chases through endless woods, didn't last. Slowly, the story faded from memory. A few years later, a different kind of darkness descended upon our family. Cancer, a cruel, selfish thief, stole my grandmother's health bit by bit. She fought for months, but in the end, the disease won. It left a hole in our lives, especially for Grandpa. Now he lives alone, the silence of the house heavy with her absence. Talking about her seems to bring a fresh wave of pain, etched deep into the lines on his face. Sometimes he murmurs about just waiting for his turn to join her. It's a heartbreaking sight. A man transformed into a solitary figure, simply waiting to die. That year was a blur of grief, a dark tunnel we all had to navigate. But with the love and support of family and friends, we eventually managed to pull through. With each passing year, the grief lessened, but Grandma's memory remained. Then, after another few years, during my senior year in high school, something happened. I walked into the house after a long day. The familiar scent of an empty house greeted me. Mom had already left for work. Pulling my backpack onto my bed, I pulled out my books and settled in for an evening of homework, studying, and the occasional break to watch TV. I shut off the TV, changed into my pajamas, and crawled into bed. Sleep, however, remained elusive. My mind was a tangled mess, tossing and turning over the events of the day. Finally, I peeked at the clock on my desk, its green glow reading almost 3:00 a.m. Just then, a sound shattered the silence, a sharp tap that echoed through the room. My eyes flew open, snapping towards the window. A wave of ice washed over me, freezing my blood solid. Memories of Grandma's story flooded back, the creature, the woods. There, pressed against the glass, was a form that blocked most of the moonlight from filtering in. If not for the sliver of moonlight peeking in around what was blocking it, I wouldn't have been able to see it at all. Its human-shaped body pressed against the window, and across its head, I could have sworn I saw movement, a flicker, like multiple tiny insects scurrying across its flesh. Then, a horrifying realization dawned on me. They weren't insects. They were eyelids. Eyelids flickering open and shut, scanning my room with frantic urgency. My breath hitched. Was this a dream? Just then, a shadowy limb, long and impossibly thin, snaked out towards the base of my window. And I locked the window. The sickening sound of the window, as the glass began to slide up, hit my ears. Terror choked and screamed in my throat. There are woods behind my mom's house too, and a sickening realization dawned on me. This wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was here. Adrenaline surged through me, and my flight or fight responses kicked in. I threw myself out of bed in a desperate scramble. My feet pounded the floor as I bolted towards the door, flinging it open, but my escape was cut short. The door slammed shut in my face, the force of it throwing me backward. A strangled cry escaped my lips as a wave of terror washed over me. My body locked up, and every muscle seized in a silent scream. Somehow, it was now in my room, that fast. It was no longer at the window. It was now above me, above my door. One of its grotesquely long limbs, tipped with a hand like a spider's claw, pressed firmly against the door, pinning me inside. Another seemed contorted at an unnatural angle, its fingers splayed against the wall in a grotesque parody of a grip. The head, if you could call it that, twisted on its neck in a way that defied human anatomy, almost spinning completely around. A chorus of eyes locked onto me. Trapped and alone, I stumbled back, my mind scrambling for any flicker of hope. The second floor was an escape route, but a leap out the window would likely result in injury, leaving me in a vulnerable position. Besides, that's where it probably wanted me. Right next to the door stood my wooden baseball bat. In a desperate lunge, I grabbed it, the wood rough against my grip. With a yell, I swung the bat with all my strength, connecting with a sickening thud. Splinters of wood rained down as the impact sent a tremor through the room. The creature recoiled slightly, its multiple eyes flickering in what might have been surprise. But the silence that followed was the most unsettling part. No roar of pain, no growl. This thing moved with an unnatural quiet. Even as it moved, it made no noise. It descended to the floor, its grotesque form dwarfing the space in my room. As it loomed closer, lowering its body in a predatory crouch, I swung the mangled bat wildly. The bat connected, with a bone-crunching impact, sending more shards of wood flying through the air. The creature recoiled, its grotesque form momentarily faltering. Seizing my chance, I bolted past the thing, flung open the bedroom door, and slammed it shut behind me with a resounding bang. Adrenaline pumping, I raced down the stairs, each step echoing in the sudden silence. Reaching the living room, I fumbled for the light switch, illuminating the space with a warm glow. Panting, I gripped the broken bat like a lifeline. Its splintered end pointed towards the top of the stairs, towards the thing in my room. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the tense silence, the creak of the front door opening. A silhouette emerged from the doorway, the dim porch light casting long shadows across her face. "There you are." My mum's voice, laced with exhaustion. "What the hell are you?" The sentence died on her lips, completely cut short. Her eyes widened, but neither she nor I had time to react. In a sharp and quick moment, a shadowy, distorted limb, tipped with a spidery claw, shot out, wrapping around my mother's waist. It snagged her, sinking its talons deep into her flesh, a sickening tear echoing in the sudden silence. A strangled noise bubbled in her throat, cut short before it could form a scream. But then I heard her scream fully formed as the thing dragged her away to the woods. I ran with all my effort, but the thing was fast, too fast. All I could do was keep running, watching, as my mom screamed with her arms folded around the creature's arm in a desperate attempt to escape. It had her, though, exactly where it wanted her, out in the open. I fell face first into the grass, a sob wrenching its way out of my chest. Warm tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision as I watched in horror. Mom's screams turned into blood-curdling shrieks, fading into a horrifying silence, as they disappeared into the indistinguishable mow of the woods. The police came, but what could they do? What could I tell them? I told them exactly what I saw. They looked at me like I was crazy, but what else could I say? For hours, I sat in a sterile interrogation room, the harsh overhead light blurring my vision. They questioned me over and over, dissecting my story, searching for inconsistencies. But all I could do was repeat the horrifying scene, my voice cracking with each retelling. There was no evidence to tie me to my mom's disappearance, nothing but my frantic pleas and the raw terror etched onto my face. Finally, they seemed to reach a reluctant roadblock. With a sigh and a dismissive glance, they released me. Now, a search party combs the backyard, venturing into the dense woods behind our house. Bloodhounds sniff the damp earth, their mournful howls echoing through the trees. In my room, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. As the harsh light of dawn breaks, I stare at the window. A large handprint, a grotesque, splayed imprint of multiple fingers, clings to the outside of the glass. A cold realization settles over me. Now I know that at least one of my grandma's stories is real. My daughter used to see me reading no-sleep stories and ask me to read to her. That's when her obsession with horror began. I found a story that was tame and dumbed it down so she could understand it. I thought it would still scare her, but the whole time she had a huge smile on her face. So I kept reading to her, usually one story a day, but sometimes I'll dangle a second story as an incentive for her to behave. A lot of your posts get a little gruesome, so most of the time I'll add in Scooby-Doo and a few more hijinks and less bloody murder, to make it a little more child-friendly so she is only slightly spooked but still enthralled. When I got a new laptop for work, I wiped the memory. I made sure to uninstall all of the browsers too, so she couldn't use the internet, just in case she figured out how to connect Wi-Fi. That way she could play games like Freddy Fish or Pajama Sam, and I don't have to worry about her going onto the internet and stumbling upon something she shouldn't. She started using the laptop to write her own short horror stories. Every time she finished a story, she would email me it by printing them out and putting them in an envelope she wrote a big E on and handing them to me. She would always beg me to drop whatever I was doing to read it. Whenever I finished, she would always ask if her story had scared me, but I never had the heart to tell her that her stories were more adorable than scary. They were mostly about princesses getting taken by bad guys or kittens fighting off monsters, and almost all of her stories had Scooby-Doo in them. Like father, like daughter, I suppose. Even though I obviously wasn't spooked, I would always tell her that she scared me, and she would always respond the same way. No way. Daddies aren't scared of anything. Now I'm certain any parent out there can tell you that is a load of shit. We're afraid of so many things. I'm afraid of losing my job, so I can't provide for my family, or something bad happening to my wife or daughter. I remember back when she was first born, it drove me crazy whenever my wife would turn her back on the cart when she was in it. I was paranoid that someone would snatch my little girl right out of the cart. After all, whenever a child gets kidnapped, they always say, "I only looked away for a minute." The day came when one of my daughter's stories actually did scare me. It's kind of hard to explain it, so I'll just post the story. It went like this. Sherry's boyfriend went out and bought some magical pixie dust. He gave the pixie dust to Sherry and told her it was sugar. He was lying to her. Sherry was so excited that she ate a whole bunch with her nose. Then she started dancing. Then she started twitching. Then she died. No one ever found out what Sherry's boyfriend did. The fact that someone died in one of her stories was off-putting enough, but to obviously reference a drug overdose was not a normal thing for a 7-year-old to write about. When I finished reading the story, my daughter was looking up at me with her big grin asking, "Did I scare you?" I tried asking her where she heard this story, but she insisted she made it up. She grabbed my arm and kept asking me if she scared me. For the first time since she started writing, I honestly told her yes. "No way, daddies aren't scared of anything," she said, and she skipped off to go play. I showed the story to my wife, and she looked at me with a scowl, scolding me for reading our daughter so many scaly stories off of the internet. I told her that I'd never read her a story like this, and that I have never read her a story where someone died. I asked my wife if it was possible that our daughter had seen it on a TV show she left on. My wife said that she hadn't watched any adult shows without me in weeks. I was convinced that my daughter must have seen this story on TV, that my wife was just out of the room, or maybe someone at her school gave her the idea. I kept racking my brain trying to come up with an answer, but when she wrote another story a couple days later, and it was back to her usual subject matter, I decided to let it go. About a week later, my wife texted me a link to a news site. A young girl named Cheryl died of a heroin overdose. Apparently she got the heroin from her boyfriend, who told her it was cold. The article said her death was being labelled as an accident, and that her boyfriend wouldn't be charged at this time. It didn't take long for me to make the connection. Someone must have left the news on and my daughter heard this story. It's possible that she didn't even know that this story was her inspiration. She just remembers an event. I thought about trying to talk to her about drugs and the story again, but she was her usual self, so if the story is just a story to her, I didn't want her to make a connection to some horrible real event. More stories came, all standard fare. I would tell her that these stories are much better and much scarier than that Sherry story. It seemed like we were moving past everything, until she wrote another really scary story. Danny was bored, so he stole a car. Danny was a bad boy. He didn't realize that the car belonged to a bad man. When the bad man found Danny, he shot Danny in the head. Then the bad man drove away. This story was worse than the first one. The somewhat childlike wording of the first story softened the blow and made it a bit easier to process. This story had no padding. It was there, in your face. Shot Danny in the head. I never thought I would hear those words from my little girl. My daughter was still just looking up at me with her big green eyes, waiting for me to say what I always said. I asked her where she heard this story, but just like she did with the Sherry story, she insisted she made it up. I told her that the story was mean, and that she shouldn't write stories like this anymore. She argued with me, and I ended up grounding her from writing. The next day I had to work late. I was waiting for my partner to finish a bit that I needed, so I thought I would take a second to see if I could find anything about my daughter's story. If she heard the first one on the news, she probably heard this one too. A little bit of Googling turned up a story about a boy named Daniel who was found dead near the interstate. The police thought it was a mugging gone wrong. Two things stuck out to me. 1. Daniel had previously served time in Juve for Grand Theft Auto, and 2. He was shot in the head. I couldn't turn up any other stories with a victim named Danny, Dan, Daniel, or anything else that's similar. This had to have been the story she heard. The only problem was that the story was posted almost 24 hours after I read my daughter's story. That didn't make sense to me. I checked every news site I could find. They all said that Danny was killed the night after my daughter wrote the story about him. I went back and looked at the story about Sherry, and it was the same. They found Sherry dead 2 days after my daughter wrote that story. How did my daughter write a story so eerily similar to a real-world event before that event even happened? It had to have been a coincidence, right? I was quiet when I went home that night, and so was my daughter. My wife told me that my daughter was sick and asked me if I was feeling under the weather as well. I told her that I was, which wasn't technically a lie, since I was feeling sick. I just don't think the pain in my stomach and the tightness in my chest had anything to do with the virus my daughter had. The next day at work was a fog for me, but I ended up getting out of work on time for once. When I got home, I noticed that my daughter's laptop was on the kitchen counter, and my wife seemed to be in a very bad mood. When I asked about the laptop, my wife told me that since our daughter was sick in bed, my wife gave her the laptop so she could pass the time, but my wife had to take the laptop from her, and she isn't allowed to write any more stories. I asked her why she was so on edge, even though the answer was obvious. My wife pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of the trash can and handed it to me. She wrote another story, and I completely understand why my wife didn't want her writing anymore. Even typing it here makes my chest tighten up like crazy. Daddy got mad. Daddy tied me and Mommy up downstairs in the basement. I'm fine. I'm hungry and thirsty. Daddy brought my T-ball bat and hit Mommy with it until she stopped moving. After Daddy left, Mommy made scary noises for a while. Mommy hasn't made any noise in a while, though. Daddy hasn't stopped crying since Mommy stopped moving. I hope Mommy and Daddy feel better. I remember his smirk, how he held out my jacket, the way he spouted off an endless list of things I should be scared of. Skinwalkers, and witches, and werewolves, oh my. He presented each one as reason after reason of why this idea was stupid, saying I still had time to flake out, save face. I remember rolling my eyes, snatching my jacket from his grasp, sliding into my car, and yelling that I'm not scared, before speeding away towards the darkening outline of the mountains. They stood out stark against the setting sun like teeth. Boy, how I wish I listened. I was wrong. He was right. I'm scared. Let me back up a bit. It all started about 2 days ago. I was out of my mind depressed, could barely get out of bed, thought about chucking myself in front of cars, over bridges, off buildings, just dying. I thought about dying all the time. And enough was enough. One of the few friends I had suggested that I try solo camping said it might clear my mind, that the wilderness, the silence, the solitude would do me good. He gave me a list of spots, some more isolated than the others. I decided on the most isolated one, which was about a 3-hour hike from the last campsite far out in the Rocky Mountain National Forest. I remember his face, the surprise, the acceptance. You sure? His voice cracked. I nodded, saying nothing. Okay, I mean it's a pretty secluded place, especially for a first-time camper. He shrugged. But then again, it's a beautiful spot. It'll definitely give you some perspective. And the night sky out there is insane. I thanked him and turned to leave, but he spoke up again. Hey, don't let the forest spook you, okay? A word of advice from a veteran. Don't go out at night, no matter what you hear. You might get totally fucked by a bear or lion. The drive up the mountains was strangely soothing. The gently curving roads that wove their way through the trees and up the rocks were exciting to navigate, and soon my mind was eased into a peaceful contemplation. I had decided to forgo electronics this trip, even going as far as securing my phone in my glove box. I wanted to be completely free of all that shit, able to focus on the now rather than ruminate about the past or fear the future. I would be gone for 5 days and 4 nights, enough time for me to, hopefully, recuperate and reassess my life and what I was doing with it. I soon descended into Estes Park and drove through the picturesque town towards RMNP, willing myself not to stay at the Stanley instead. I found the entrance to the park with ease and continued to the closest lot to my campsite. Night was now falling, and I silently cursed myself for leaving so late. I sat in my car for a good 30 minutes before deciding that it would be too risky hiking 3 hours in near pitch black. There were 4 other tents set up in the lot I was at with room for 1 more, and soon I had my own tent set up. That night passed comfortably. I was surrounded by chatting, laughing people and unruly, but happy children who ran round and round screaming. A few of them offered me roasted hot dogs and s'mores and beers, and I filled my belly smiling. I was rolled up in my sleeping bag before the last light from the dying embers faded away. The second night didn't go so smoothly. I woke up late, well rested, but still groggy, and took my time repacking my tent. I hesitated at first, wondering if I should just stay there, but at 3 p.m. another family showed up with proof they had reserved the site. So I gathered my things and set off, and immediately got lost. Navigating by map and compass for the first time, and alone, is a lot harder than it sounds. And the trees can be misleading, can turn you around, make you think you're on the right path, when really you're miles from where you're supposed to be. Instead of taking me 3 hours to get to the site, it took me nearly twice that time, and I was swiftly losing what little light was left in the day. Finally I found the site, but before I breathed a sigh of relief, I haphazardly set up my tent, building a small fire in front. It was dark now, and I was jumpy. Every sound I heard was seemingly magnified, every shadow cast by the dim light of the fire, a menace. Spooked, I crawled into the tent and curled up in my bag, trying to will myself into sleep. After a while, I was dozing, about to drift off when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a foot crunching outside. My eyes shot open, and I reached for my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. I waited. I heard the sound again, someone, or something was definitely walking around my tent. It sounded like whatever they was trying to be quiet, stealthy. That went on for hours in inconsistent bursts, until I finally decided it was an animal, scavenging for the scraps or inspecting my tent. By dawn I was dozing again, and the noise had finally stopped. I told myself I would sleep for an hour or 2, giving myself time to rest up. I woke up disoriented, exhausted, and started to panic before remembering I was out camping, and that I needed to start hiking back. Now. But when I exited the tent, I saw that the sun was already setting. To say I was upset would be an understatement. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide what to do. I wanted to go home. I wanted to leave, see how far I could get out there. But deep down I knew I'd instantly get lost and probably end up in a worse situation. So, I began collecting as much wood as I could to build a big-ass fire and prepared to hunker down for the night. The light from the sun seemed to disappear unfathomably fast. The third night was, pretty problematic. I sat awake in my tent for hours after the sun went down waiting. I'd left the fire going for as long as the wood lasted. I know this isn't kosher for camping, but I was improvising, and I was absolutely terrified. The darkness around me seemed to crush the light from the fire, making it seem small, pathetic, a tiny candle in a sea of shadows. For hours I sat there, listening, afraid. Finally, I realized I was just being ridiculous, that what I had heard the night before was nothing to fear, that my subconscious, my monkey mind, was just playing tricks on me, keeping me alert for no reason. So I bundled myself up and laid down, and I heard it, softly at first, a footstep, then 2, 3, growing louder, bolder. I sat up and felt my eyes increase to the size of saucers, and my breath quickened. What was that? I had to know. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't. I was operating purely off of fear. I heard the noise. It sounded like something running and running around and around my tent. Suddenly, the side of my tent pushed in, as if someone was slapping it from the outside. Hey, I yelled, scared out of my wits. Hey, I'm awake. I'm in here. I tried to stand, tripping myself up in my sleeping bag in the process, and slammed into the front of the tent. Scrambling up, I swiftly unzipped the flap and ran outside with a red-tinted flashlight. I saw a shape scurry away and followed. And there, standing at the edge of the firelight, barely visible, was the silhouette of a person. They were standing with their back towards me. Their arms were hanging in strange positions by their sides, their head pointed straight away from me. I took a step towards them, and a branch cracked underneath me. The sound seemed to startle the person, and they turned their head ever so slightly. Hey, I said again, what the fuck, man? And it boiled up, a sound that crescendoed into a scream. It was laughter, and it echoed around me, rattling around in my skull. I ran, leaping into my tent, zipping it up behind me, curling into my sleeping bag, crying. And the world around me exploded, or rather imploded. The walls of the tent shook, like hundreds of hands were slapping it, poking it, punching it. Outside, what sounded like dozens of people running around shattered the silence. I don't know how or when I fell asleep. I think I fainted. Either way, I woke up the next day to a reddish glow encompassing my surroundings. I sat up and ran outside, looking around for proof of what I had heard. But there was nothing, no footprints, handprints, or any disturbance at all. Fuck this, I muttered to myself, throwing my things chaotically into my bag. I would leave today in the dark. I couldn't stay another night here. I was just starting to unpull the tent when I heard it, a sound in the distance, perhaps carried to me by the wind which was picking up around me. Help me, please, oh God, help me. I reacted more out of instinct than logic, and began running towards the sound before realizing that I, in no way, was in a place to help whoever was screaming. Still, I tried to locate the source of the sound, following the voice for about 30 minutes. Where are you? I yelled, looking around me through the maze of trees. I'm here. Where are you? Quickly the screams descended into a deep, unsettling laughter. Scared out of my mind, I turned and ran back the way I came. By some miracle, I made it back to my site, grabbed my pack, and uprooted the poles of the tent, thinking that I would just roll it up and carry it back instead of taking the time to fold it neatly and shove it into its bag. Around me, the mountains loomed up like fangs, like I was about to be swallowed whole by a monstrous mouth. As I pulled each pole, the tent fell a little, but it was only on the third pole of out 6 that I realized it wasn't falling fully flat. Confused, I peered into the tent and reeled in horror. too afraid to even scream. There was someone sitting inside, but not just anyone. It was me, sitting there, pallor and bone-thin, a too-wide grin plastered on my face. A single droplet of blood rolled down from each eye, which, instead of having green irises, were totally, wholly black. I jumped back, tripping over my own feet. Laughter rose up around me, and as I scrambled up, I saw my hand that was not my hand reach out from the tent, followed swiftly by the other, then the head. My face that was not my face looked up at me, still smiling, then laughed again. I screamed. I stood. I ran. And I ran. I didn't even know if I was running the right way. I couldn't even use the sun any more for guidance, since it had almost fully set. I ran without looking where I was going. I kept looking behind me to see if that thing was following me. I could feel the trees scratching me up, pushing against me, like they were trying to hold me back, hold me still until that thing came for me. Suddenly a light flashed in my face, and I ran into something solid, something black, something that wrapped around me. I instantly cowered, hiding my face in my hands. Shit. Oh, please God, no, 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 no. I heard my own voice, terrified, shaking. Hey, calm down. It's okay. You just scared me. Calm down. What's wrong? I looked up and into the worried grey eyes of a human face. The face of a middle-aged man, to be exact. He was holding me up. The flashlight he was using lay fallen at our feet, creating strange shadows behind us. I looked back, fearful of what I might see, but there was nothing, only trees swinging slowly in the slight breeze. Hey, he said again. Was that you? Screaming? I came out here to check. I couldn't speak. I was too terrified. I shook my head. Were you camping out there alone? He asked, letting me go and bending down to retrieve the flashlight. I nodded, then began crying. Hey, it's okay. It can be spooky out here. Come on, my car is right over there. He gestured with his head back behind him. I wiped my nose and blinked, finally finding my voice. Who are you? He glanced at me, then away. I'm, a park ranger. But he didn't look like one. He was wearing a smooth black suit, black tie, and white shirt. And his shoes were polished leather, not hiking boots. Come on, he said again, taking my pack and swinging it onto his back. As he did so, his jacket flapped slightly, and I saw what looked like a Sig Sauer handgun strapped to his belt. Okay, I said, looking back behind me again. How did you find me? He shrugged. Good hearing. We entered a small clearing, and I saw a matte black SUV with tinted windows, headlights flaring, engine idling, parked in the middle of it. He popped the trunk and threw my bag in as I climbed into the passenger side seat. He climbed in the driver's seat and asked me where he should take me. I told him the lot number, and we were on our way. After a few moments, he flipped the cubby between us open and pulled out a bag. Corn nuts? He asked, holding out the bag to me. I took it gratefully and began chomping away. I licked my fingers, then looked back at him. So are you really a ranger? He looked at me, then back to the road, but still I stared at him, transfixed. He looked exhausted, his wood-coloured hair dishevelled and dirty from the forest. Eyed. The SUV jerked to a sudden stop, and the man let out a slow, low breath. His eyes narrowed, and he looked over at me, then back to the dirt trail in front of us. I followed his gaze, feeling the fear churning up inside me. And there, in the middle of the road, was me. The me that was not me. Its limbs hung limply, as if they were broken, and that sickly smile was still plastered across the face. It waved. The man looked back at me, then back at the thing that was not me, then back at me. I met his gaze. "I don't get paid enough for this shit," the man muttered before slamming his foot on the accelerator straight towards the thing. We both felt the impact. The car bounced over the body, and the man kept driving, but around us, in between the trees, stared into the darkness. Laughter boiled up, manic and persistent. We reached the lot in silence, bathed in the first light of the rising sun. The man beside me seemed to be deep in thought, distracted. I was still scared, but hopeful that whatever that thing was, it was now dead, crushed by the car, or at least so badly wounded that it would soon succumb. The SUV slowed to a stop, and the man popped the trunk and hopped out. He walked to the back and grabbed my pack as I jumped out. He handed it to me and I took it, then thanked him for everything. "No problem," he said. "All in a day's or night's work." His lips quivered as if he was about to smile. I turned to leave, but he spoke up again. "Hey," I turned to face him again. "If you ever want to talk about what you saw, or, just call me." He held out a card. I took it and looked down at it. It was matte black and only had a single number written on it. There was no area code. "Fan," I began, but I heard a door slam and looked up. The man was already back in his car. He waved at me, then sped off back the way we had come, back towards that thing. I shoved the card in my pocket, climbed into my car and left, breathing a sigh of relief. I still haven't told anyone about what happened, even when they asked why I refused to go camping ever again. I just shrug and tell them it wasn't my thing, that I prefer a warm bed and the bustling sounds of a busy city. Every so often, though, I'll pull out the card, my fingers lingering over my phone, wondering if I should call. Wondering who the man really was, and if he'd really be able to explain what happened to me.